Hello and welcome to IGPP Expert Talks. I am Heena Goswami, Editorial Consultant with Institute for Governance, Policies and Politics, New Delhi. Today, to discuss the state of India's economy and international trade, we have with us noted economist Dr. Badri Narayanan Gopalakrishnan, an economist, data scientist, a former diplomat, policy advisor, published author of 8 books and 250 plus research papers and articles. Dr. Badri has served Government of India as the lead advisor and head of trade and commerce at the Niti Aayog. Welcome to IGPP Expert Talks, Dr. Badri. I'll proceed with the questions now. You're an economist and you largely specialize in the international trade and economy. The past year, despite various headwinds, has seen overall steady growth in India's foreign trade. The country's overall exports in October 2022 were US $58.36 billion, showing a positive growth of 4.03% over the same period last year. Overall imports in October 2022 were around US $73 billion, exhibiting positive growth of 11.82% over the same period last year. As someone who has headed the International Trade Division at the Niti Aayog, are you happy with these figures? What are some of your concerns about trade growth in the coming year?
Thank you very much, Heena, for having me, and I also thank IGPP for organizing this. To begin with, this is a great question and an important question that comes to the mind of anyone who is interested in international trade policy for India. And the numbers that you showed clearly tell us the story that our exports are growing, definitely, which is a great news. But at the same time, the imports are growing much faster. And this is actually a consistent trend that we have seen in the past. I personally think that it is not necessarily a bad thing that the imports are increasing more than exports. The reason is that we are, like, whenever we grow very fast, we are a very import-dependent economy when it comes to energy in particular. So if in those figures, if you look at the breakdown, which I've not looked at it carefully, but if you look at that 73 billion number that you said for imports, if you look at the breakdown, I'm pretty sure quite a significant part of it would be oil imports. And if you also look at the oil prices now vis-a-vis 1 year ago, that also would have grown a lot. And basically, one part of the story here is that oil imports have increased and oil prices have increased, and that is why the imports have increased a lot. But that is only one part of the story. So we are still dependent on imports of various other products also. Whenever we have a solid growth in GDP, one of the components that is going to increase a lot is consumption, right? So consumption is an important part of GDP. So when consumption increases, it's not necessary that all the consumption is going to be met domestically. So we have to also import a lot. So from that point of view, increase in imports is actually not necessarily a bad thing. It just says that we are consuming a lot, and so we also import a lot. Secondly, even for production, one thing we should always remember is that whenever we export a lot, we also end up importing a lot. So for example, we are actually exporting a lot of petroleum products. We are exporting petrol, diesel, and so on. But then we don't have oil. So we have to import oil to export these products, right? So a large part of our imports are oil and large part of our exports are actually petroleum products. So if we take them away, then we'll get the real story. But I'm pretty sure that even after this, we will find that the imports are quite large, and exports are also large, but the gap is going to be smaller. The gap that we see here, when we include oil and petroleum, that will reduce. So this is just to explain a bit of mechanics behind these numbers, right? So we, first of all, we should not actually think of imports always negatively. I do understand that very large trade deficit is not good, and very large current account deficit is not good, and if that also sustains for a long time, it is not necessarily good. But that doesn't mean that we have to really work hard to reduce our imports through uh, policies that are kind of barriers, right? So I did a lot of analytics on this a few years ago uh, when tariffs were increasing globally, right? US, China, and many other countries are increasing tariffs. So what I found from that kind of analytics is that yes, if you increase those tariffs, your imports may fall, but then imports will not fall. Imports are not like a like a single variable that is standalone, right? So if imports fall, that also means that why do the imports fall? Because they become expensive. And if they have become expensive, your overall prices are going to increase, which means that your consumption is going to take a hit, which also means that your production is going to, your producers are going to face increase in input prices, because the inputs are a lot of inputs are imported. So that also means that your exports are going to take a hit, because you're going to export to other countries and your exports will be expensive. So basically, we are talking about a very complicated, interconnected economy, and we cannot have linear narratives where we say that imports are bad, imports are killing your economy. So if imports increase, we are in trouble. No, many times we do see this kind of increase in imports. So that is, I would definitely say that this particular observation that you mentioned is not a major cause of concern for us, to directly come to your question. But having said that, this is the broader thing I wanted to mention. But having said that, we should not actually stop our efforts of import substitution. So we should be working hard to reduce our dependence on imports. But that hard work that I'm talking about is not just initially more expensive. The hard work is more in terms of developing domestic capacity. We should develop our domestic production capacity so that we can rely on. So that is what I would say. Like basically two simple summary points. So first is that increase in imports is not necessarily bad for the economy, and that is not something that we should be necessarily worried about. Secondly, yes, it is a desirable thing to reduce our dependence on imports, but not by making imports artificially expensive, but by developing our domestic capabilities. And this is actually whatever I said now is actually one of the statements by our month ago, where he said that we have to export to the rest of the world very prominently. And when we export, when we are able to go and compete with other countries in other various destinations, we will automatically develop the competitiveness that is needed to exports that are coming in. So basically, I'm kind of expanding on what the Prime Minister said. But the Prime Minister said export so much that we reduce our dependence on imports. So I think that is one point that I wanted to mention.
To talk about the interconnectedness of economies, the global economy is not really in good shape. The IMF's World Economic Outlook update, released in January 2023, projects that global growth will fall to 2.9% in 2023. The 2023 forecast is 0.2 percent point higher than predicted in October 2022, but is below the historical average of 3.8%. Rising interest rates and the war in Ukraine continue to weigh on economic activity. What does it mean for India? Do you think India needs to take some serious measures to secure its economy?
Yeah, this is again a great question, and definitely when we are talking about this global uh, kind of slowdown, and it is I mean currently recession is not on the cards, but it's more of slowdown in growth. That is definitely going to have a bearing on our demand for our exports, right? So if the world is not growing enough, then the export demand is going to fall. We have seen some signs of that recently when we looked at some of the data of exports from India. So this is one reason why our export numbers that you just mentioned, they only grew by 4%. This is one of the reasons. One of the reasons is that the demand is low, relatively speaking. So it is definitely a matter of concern that the global economy is not in a great shape, and we are an integral part of the global economy. We are a large player now, and we cannot insulate ourselves from what is happening in the rest of the world. So, what steps can we take here? One is that because of this war and also because of this recession, we have got a few sweet spots, right? The first is quite prominent in the media that we are able to get oil from Russia at a low rate, and that is actually one reason why our inflation is much more stable compared to the Western countries. So that is one sweet spot we are in. The second sweet spot is that there is a lot of trade diversion happening away from Russia, away from China, and these are because of sanctions, but also away from Ukraine because of the war-related damages there. So definitely, we don't have the capacity to produce all that these countries are producing, but we do have some capacity of some other things they are producing, right? So that is one area that we should work very hard on. We have to see where are the opportunities. Like somewhere the supply is falling, so why don't we go and fill up the space? The Southeast Asian countries are really good at that. The countries like Vietnam and so on. So Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, whole group of countries, they're really good at finding these gaps and filling them very quickly. We need to also take that path. Another sweet spot we have is not just this trade diversion, but also a lot of investments pouring into India. Because despite all the shortcomings and difficulties that we have, we are being looked upon by many countries as a formidable partner or a formidable investment destination, particularly in the wake of China's lack of acceptability globally. So a lot of investments are moving away from China. They are going to other countries, and many companies think of India as a natural next destination. There are a lot of practical difficulties here, but then there's some, that's widely thought of. So you also asked, how do we prepare for this recession? So I would, relatively speaking, I'm an optimist. I would actually focus on the sweet spots. Like, how do we really work on taking advantage of this trade diversion? How do we, in the sense, we are already doing some things like, negotiating these cheap imports of crude oil, for example, and then similarly identifying the export destinations where these guys were supplying. So that is the second thing. And the third thing is, making our investment climate friendly enough that we can attract all these investments. Because I've seen that is something that we really struggle a lot, particularly at a state government level, because investments at the end of the day, they're going to depend on the state government. So Only if the state governments function very effectively and aggressively attract those investments, we are going to get them. So some states are doing well, some states are not, but we do many times we hear from the investors that we want to go to this particular state, but this particular state is not open enough. The other state is open, but we don't want to go there. We have for various logistical reasons. Right? So I think that there we need a lot of work. We have to do a lot of coordination, and organization I was part of, Niti Aayog, has been working on this, coordinating the state governments with the national government and so on. So I think that we have to come up with some ideas on and strategies on tapping in to these investment opportunities.
India is also making huge investments in infrastructure growth, and with projects like GatiShakti and Sagarmala, India is trying to build its logistics capacities to minimize transportation cost and provide faster and better connectivity to its industries and various manufacturing and exports hubs. Do you think the kind of investment India is making right now are enough? What do you think India should do more about it?
Yeah, definitely. This is one of the points I did not mention in my previous discussion, but definitely it's a very important aspect of being able to competitive in terms of be competitive in terms of exports, being able to displace or substitute imports, and also to attract those investments that I was talking about, right? So for all these things, we need to do a lot of things. One major thing is this improvements in logistics, not incremental improvements, but transformative improvements. And in that regard, GatiShakti, Sagarmala, this ULIP, Unified Linked Infrastructure Platform. So that is another. So there are a lot of these things that are going on, and the fundamental idea of all these policies and programs and frameworks is to, like you rightly said, minimize transportation costs, increase efficiencies, and improve connectivity between different parts of the country and to the rest of the world. So many times, one thing I also did not mention before is the trade policy shifts that we are facing now. So we are negotiating a lot of free trade agreements, and I personally think many of them are going to help us because we are going to get access to new markets. But then again, there you can only export more if you have the infrastructure to do that. If you don't have enough ports, if you don't have enough connectivity from your production locations to the ports and so on, you cannot export. There is no point in signing free trade agreements if you don't have the logistics to support them, right? So I think in that regard, government is taking all these steps simultaneously, which is great. In terms of the gaps and what can be done more, definitely, in fact, our finance minister mentioned when she was announcing the relief for COVID a couple of years ago in 2020, she made a very nice statement that I always keep thinking about when it comes to, is, is the current level of policy strategies, is that enough, or more should be done? This is a general question. You can ask for anything. So the way she handled that was that, we, in a country like India, which is so large and which has so many common people, many of whom are, earn low incomes and so on, we can never sit back and relax and say that we have done enough. So from that point of view, definitely, whatever we have been doing a lot, but that is not enough. We have to do much more. I think in terms of these shipping and ports, we have to really scale up a lot. If you see how China grew, although we don't, definitely China is not a role model in many aspects. But one aspect in which China has done really well from the beginning is this infrastructure development. So they developed these massive ports and massive infrastructural developments, roads, trains, everything, railroads and everything. And we are actually, despite all the great efforts we are taking, we are still taking, our efforts are still like baby steps compared to where they are. So we have to really scale up a lot. We have to massively increase the scales of our ports and so on. And we have to, one advantage we have compared to many other countries, including China, is that many of our ports have a long way to go. So we can actually leapfrog actually. So many of the ports we can directly, we are talking about some new ports in states like Kerala. So when the ports are built, from the beginning, they can have all the latest technologies. So you can have, for example, use of AI or blockchain and big data and all these kind of technologies to monitor movements of ships and do a lot of procedures automatically. The customs procedures, like for example, when a ship enters the port, uh, all the shipments in there should be, we should be able to scan all of them and enter the system automatically, and all the customs clearances should be done automatically. So this is a very kind of futuristic way of thinking. But if you're building a new port, why don't you build it that way, like with all the best practices, or even better than the world's best practices? We should aim for that, and I think that is where we should aim for. We should scale up. We should modernize. We should upgrade. And we should do all these things, and I think then we can. So then it's a kind of a chicken and egg problem. People are not producing a lot because they know that exporting is difficult, and since we are not exporting a lot, the ports are not big enough. So it's kind of who builds the cat kind of problem. So why don't the ports take the first step? They expand everything. They say, yeah, we have the space now. You guys can export whatever you want. You guys can import whatever you want. So then the other things will come in place. So I think that's the way to go.
To talk of one more dynamic of the international trade and economy, climate change and environmental concerns are becoming points of contestations among different nations. And in recent COPs meeting also, there were concerns and contestations among different groups of countries. India is still trying to make up for the loss of environment, but it cannot really commit to what many of the world's powerful economies are asking it to do. Do you think India's position on climate change issue is just? Do you think as a developing economy and with a huge number of people to feed and a country to grow, India can afford climate concerns? We all agree that climate change concerns are real, but what can India as a nation do in its economic policies to better handle this concern?
In terms of climate change, it's a very important issue, and we are fully committed as a country to fight it. And in fact, some of my recent analysis, when you looked at the Paris Agreement, commitments and where do different countries stand in the light of those commitments, we are pretty much ahead of many countries. So we are doing really well in terms of those commitments. But again, this is one of those areas where whatever you do is not enough, right? Like I told before for the other question. So we have to do a lot. We have to, like our Prime Minister has announced this Life Initiative, Lifestyle for Environment. And these are all some new concepts we are kind of giving to the world in this G20. We are leading. So we're coming up with these new ideas that that we don't only have to focus on fossil fuels reduction and so on, but we can actually work on consumption-based emissions and getting back to some of our traditional kind of activities which can be less emissions intensive and so on. So we are doing a lot there. But when it comes to the trade-off between this kind of climate change action and economic growth, we don't afford to even allow the trade-off to happen, basically. So we are in a situation where we have to grow, very rapidly. If you really want to become a Viksit Bharat, like in a few years, and we need to actually uh, accelerate our growth a lot. And if we have to accelerate our growth, we cannot have anything that stops us from growing fast. But at the same time, we cannot also afford to pollute the environment, emit a lot while growing fast. So there is this kind of trade-off that is somewhat visible. That is how our strategy has been to move towards renewables. So we want to consume the same amount of energy. We want to consume much more energy, but lot of that energy will be renewables. Secondly, we also have been increasing our energy efficiency hugely. So with all these things, we are working on it. But what we don't prefer or what we don't like to happen is when we are doing so well, when we per capita emissions are so low, in India, when that per capita emissions is also falling over time from a very low base. And when you're doing all these steps, we have our own SDGs that we target to reducing emissions, all these things we're doing. We should not be in a pressure from other countries to get into some kind of penalty kind of situation, right? So right now, for example, CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism being proposed by the EU, that is a good example where we are being forced externally to not produce this or that or not export this or that, particularly in a very short time frame. So this is like we are not being given sufficient time for that. So I think that is worrisome in my opinion. So we have to be very careful on how do we fight this. We are not the only ones. Many other countries are staring at this very carefully. So I think that is something we have to have a very fine balance. We cannot just say that these are bad and we oppose it and so on, because then our image may get damaged. People may think that we are against climate change action or so on. So we have to really make our action speak in terms of climate change mitigation and say that this is different from that. There are different pathways to reducing emissions. You cannot say that this is the only path. This is my way or highway kind of approach doesn't work. There are different pathways. And we are definitely committed to doing that. For example, we want to produce steel using green hydrogen. For example, we are working on ramping up our green hydrogen capacity. We've invested billions of dollars in that. But we need time. So I think we have to really negotiate hard with countries like EU on this point. And of course, in addition to this, there are many other things like environmental standards and so on, labor standards and so on. So we have to be very careful on these things. So we should not allow our commitment for SDGs, commitment for reducing emissions, improving labor conditions, and so on, to bulldoze our commitment should be there, but that should not be misconstrued and taken in a wrong direction to bulldoze our growth potential. That's my thought process.
I would like to go back to port development that you talked about, and I would like you to elaborate a little. Shipping and ports are most significant parts of any economy's infrastructure, and they are very significant for the growth of the economy. India has now a vision 2030 for shipping and port sector, and it is seeing huge investment in the sector in recent years. Do you feel whatever is being done is enough? Do you think Ministry of Shipping, Ports and Waterways is doing whatever is required to propel the growth of this sector?
Yeah, in fact, the answer for this would be very similar to what I, talked about earlier. So definitely a lot of interesting projects are going on. A lot of investments are coming in, and we have a lot of efforts both from the public sector and private sector. So I think we are on the right track. But I think again, I would like to re-emphasize that the vision is quite well defined, and but we may have to kind of like whenever we talk about a vision document, like I've myself been working on Vision 2047 for India at Niti Aayog, and I'm continuing to work on that even now. So what I realize is that this vision, when we develop the vision, how much ever forward-looking we may be, we may not be able to, even internalize things that happen few months from now, right? So then how can I think of like 5, 10 years from now? So which is not necessarily a bad thing. So I'm not saying that we should not have vision, but we should have a vision, but then we have to keep updating it every few months or every couple of years or something like that. So from that perspective, I think Vision 2030 is really good, but it has to be updated. So given all the changes in geopolitics, the much bigger, much grander role that we are playing now than even a year ago, 2 years ago, um, a kind of role that we play in terms of international affairs, in terms of trade, in terms of investments. So I think those things have to be factored in, and definitely even from technology perspective, also there are a lot of advancements happening every month, every year. So those also should be taken into account. So I think broadly we have to the vision has to be much grander. We have to think of uh, much more efficient ports, much bigger, much larger scale in ports, maybe even many more ports. We have such a large, long peninsula, a peninsular part, the coast. So we can actually afford to have more ports. For example, we do have a major plan in Andaman Island, Nicobar Islands, and those kind of should be accelerated. So I think we have to work on it in a large scale. One more thing that we have not done a lot of made a lot of progress is also acquiring ports overseas, like the Chabahar port that we did in Iran. So we need more of that so that we, now many countries have been traveling across the world. I see many countries are looking towards India for investments, for collaboration, for technological transference. So on, looking to the West for help. Now we are actually being looked up by many developing countries, because many developing countries are losing confidence in and trust in the West. So we and also I don't have to say much about China. Right? China has already made a lot of inroads there, and we all know what's happening there. So India is being looked upon as a soft power that is very friendly and that can create formidable infrastructure and so on. So I think we have to tap into that sentiment that is broadly there, and we have to do a lot of overseas, investments in the shipping and ports area, so that our path is also easier. When we export somewhere, we have to have the path cleared, and ease of approaching different countries, particularly some of the landlocked countries. You have to first, like Iran is a good example. You go to Iran and then you go into some of the Central Asian countries from there, and we can actually bypass Pakistan, so we can directly go to Iran. So many such things have to be taken into account. I think a lot of geopolitical strategic aspects should be taken into account. And I think the vision is great, but it has to be updated and modified in periodic intervals to take into account all the geopolitical changes and the global economic changes.
Now, to talk about a very debatable issue, that is privatization. Most of the world's economic powers are privatizing infrastructure, including ports and shipping. India is also doing so, and recently there has been a thrust on it in the shipping sector also. What is your opinion on this? Do you think it would go well with India's society?
No, I think privatization is a very important part of growth and development strategy. Generally, not only in this area, but in general. Um, in my opinion, the government should be there only in sectors where there can be what in economics we call as market failure. Only in, like, for example, the nationalization of banks was done partly because banks, if you let the private banks have their way, they may not go to a very remote rural village. And for that, you need the public sector. Only public sector will have that kind of thought process that, yeah, we should go there and serve because that's important. But from a commercial point of view, it's not viable. So no private sector won't do that. So we have to look at those kind of strategic sectors and strategically important, and sectors that are not commercially viable, that won't be taken up by private sector. Those aspects should be taken up by public sector. And defense kind of things, like where you don't want to privatize the army, for example, right? So there are clear boundaries where privatization cannot be done. But shipping and ports is an area where there are two aspects here. Like, we have had public sector, dominating this area for a very long time. What did we achieve from that? So if you really do some academic study, detailed rigorous study, we would see that it was very stagnant. Efficiencies were not increasing, scales were not increasing, a lot of red tape and so on. So that is why privatization would be an important step there. So if you have the private sector come in, what's going to happen is it's going to be completely commercial. So if there's a lot of traffic, but the port will grow faster, right? So if it is a public sector port, then that may not happen. The growth is going to be decided by the government, whereas the traffic is going to be decided by the private sector, right? So there will be a mismatch. Whereas if it is privatized, the authority, the private company that is running the port, for making money, they will keep expanding because the flows are coming in. Another aspect is, the second aspect is that we have to come out of this thought process that private sector is evil. I'm definitely not advocating that we should have crony capitalism. We need to have some chosen favorites and so on. So that is not what I'm talking about. What I'm saying is that, what is private sector in essence? In essence, private sector is basically private people, like common people walking on the street. They all constitute private sector. So of course, it so happens that companies that are going to back these kind of contracts, they need to have certain scale. So you typically look at large companies. But at the end of the day, private sector is nothing but people, like private people. So it can be rich people, it can be poor people. That is different, but it is all about people. So I think we have to come out of the stigma that private sector is evil and public sector is benevolent. So we have seen many times that public sector has not delivered in this kind of commercial activities, and private sector has delivered only because they have a commercial interest. This is a commercial activity, and private sector has commercial interest. So we have to leave it to the private sector. Public sector should be there in ports to the extent that you need a particular strategic port in a strategic location. And like I was talking about the Chabahar port and so on, right? Like the private sector may not actually even be interested in buying such ports. So those kind of situations where private sector cannot even go in, there the public sector government can go in and do that. But otherwise, I think, again, it's my thought based on analysis and situations. Privatization in ports is actually quite good, as long as it is done in a very fair way and very open, transparent way. So I think we should not worry. From a social and a society point of view also, we should not worry about it, as long as all the procedures are taken into account. For example, one typical reason why privatization is denounced is saying about to exploit the environment. They're going to harm the resources and so on. But there are systems and procedures for that. As long as they follow those systems and procedures, for example, environmental impact assessment and all these things, as long as those are done and they are taken care of, they should go ahead. So we cannot say that we won't even do this with some preconceived notions and some kind of prejudice. We have to actually go through all the systems and procedures, and then if everything is met, you have to go. If it is not met, you are not going to award the contract. They are not going to get this, right? So that system of transparency, fairness, and openness, and law and order, all the legalities. If these things are all taken care of, then definitely the privatization is the way to go.
Thank you so much for giving us your valuable time and informing us about the state of India's economy and international trade. Thank you for joining us today.